My name is Tracy Young, and I am transitioning actually out of the Bush Institute, but still working with the Laura Bush Foundation for America's Libraries, and have recently moved to Dallas as of about a year and a half ago, but still very much involved in this arena, and from my background, which you can probably see from the bio, I was early on in the No Child Left Behind arena, so please feel free to throw things. I'm sure they were all baked goods out there that are still out there, but so accountability and assessments and really even then looking at career and college readiness sort of as the thing that followed on with kind of achievement gap and accountability. Has been something I've looked at for most of my career. So very excited to have this conversation today with these folks and to talk about where we are now, which is really great. So I'll let these guys and gals introduce themselves as well, but thank you so much. We're going to be talking about creating a pipeline for student success. So I'll very quickly introduce everybody and then have them sort of talk a little bit about themselves and where they are in their work. So we have Morgan Polikoff from USC. So everybody, a round of applause. Thank you. And Morgan, like I said, is from USC, and we do actually invite people in from out of state to talk to us. So that's very, very magnanimous of us as Texans. We also have Anna Eastman here from Houston ISD, or from Houston School Board. So great to have you here. So thank you. And then Pedro Martinez from San Antonio ISD. So thank you very much. So wonderful. Pedro, I don't know if you want to kick us off.
Sure. So Pedro Martinez, I've been superintendent now. Next month will be 1 year. New to Texas, came through Nevada. I was in Nevada for 5 years, worked as superintendent in Northern Nevada, the number 2 person in Southern Nevada, which has about 320,000 children, as well as I worked in the governor's office. And so I got a chance to see all levels of the state of Nevada. Nevada is a much smaller state than Texas. And then I grew up in Chicago, where I worked in the Chicago Public Schools for former Secretary Arne Duncan for 7 years. He and I left right around the same time in 2009. And in San Antonio, you know, what's interesting about our district, we're a county, Bexar County, that has about 16 school districts. We're the inner city core, so we're right around the downtown area. If you know San Antonio, we pretty much, our district is everything within Highway 410, which is a loop. And we have about 93% of our children that are economically disadvantaged. But more importantly, we have the poorest zip codes in our county, or in our district. And we have some of the most densest of zip codes. So for example, one of our zip codes, 780207, which is the west side, has over 50,000 residents and has the highest poverty rate in the county of Bexar County. And so it's interesting because coming into San Antonio, you know, I had always thought about Harlandale and Edgewood and other districts that are smaller, very, very poor. And I thought, okay, that's where most of the poverty is at. And what I found out was it really exists within our district. The challenges that come with that is the fact that most of our poverty is multi-generational. When I look at, for example, our college readiness, you know, a previous speaker said that 20% of children in Texas are college ready. In my district, it's 5%. And so, you know, these are the challenges that we have. So we're implementing a lot of great initiatives to try to change that, and be happy to get into that in a little bit later.
Great, thank you. Anna?
So I'm Anna Eastman, and I've been serving on the Houston ISD School Board for 6 years. I came by this work as a parent advocate. I was a school social worker briefly in the Edgewood district, actually in San Antonio, many years ago, and when we moved to Houston, got very involved in the schools in the district I represent now, and then my own children's schools. I came about my interest and kind of passion for school reform serendipitously when I got tapped on the shoulder by people in my community to run for the school board. I initially said, no way, I will never do that. I don't have a good grasp of policy and the things that happen in that arena, and then decided that I wasn't going to be happy with the other people who were interested in running to represent me as one of their constituents, and ran in a very competitive race 6 years ago that was really centered around all the same reform issues that we're talking about now. teacher quality platform, school choice platform. My own children have been in HISD schools and still are. We loved as a family the options that we had. I think we were really in the peak of policies that were set around school choice and decentralized decision making, and living that without really knowing the nuts and bolts of it until I got on the school board. And I think, you know, we heard from the last panel the challenges, you know, the emerging almost crisis we have around educating our kids. And in my role now, I think the biggest challenge for creating this pipeline for success I see is a disconnect around policies that we create at my level or at the state level, and then what they look like in practice. And I think we've heard that over and over already, starting from last night to this morning. And well, I sit with a body that I came on to kind of at this crest of the wave of school reform in HISD. We put in place our teacher evaluation system, which was the first evaluation system, I think, in Texas to have student outcomes as a part of it. We were expanding upon our merit pay system. We were building new magnets. And at the same time, we were putting programs in place to aggressively focus on our lowest performing schools, where our most struggling kids were. But those initiatives were really top down, and they were the beginning of an abandonment of kind of relinquishment from the leadership level. And so we kind of find ourselves in this crisis between how do we give people who work closest to the kids the resources and the authority to do their jobs while maintaining a high set of standards and accountability for what we want our kids to achieve.
My name is Morgan Polikoff. I'm an associate professor at the University of Southern California, and I do research on the design, implementation, and effects of standards assessment and accountability systems. So that means things like studying the implementation of content standards in the classroom during the No Child Left Behind era, studying the design of school and teacher accountability policies. For instance, one project that we did was we read and analyzed all of the state waiver applications, the No Child Left Behind waiver applications, and sort of critique the design of school and teacher accountability policies in those applications. Work which I think is relevant now as ESSA has devolved a lot of authority about the design of accountability systems to the states. Two projects that I'm currently working on actually both have a Texas component to them. So one project, and sort of the vast majority of my time right now, is again focused on standards implementation, but particularly what curriculum materials are schools and districts adopting to align with new standards. So that's a 5-state study. 4 of the states are Common Core states, and 1 of the states is Texas. And one great thing about Texas, which you may or may not be aware of, is that you guys keep the best data on what textbooks are purchased by schools and districts of any state that I've found. So that has making my life really easy. In other states, it has amazed me that basically school districts have, in many cases, well, first of all, states have no idea what textbooks are being used in districts, but then districts often have no idea what books are being used in schools and classrooms, which to me seems like a sort of fundamental element of what's going on in schools. So that's one study. And another study is a part of a team that's been funded by the Institute of Education Sciences to more generally study the implementation of college and career-ready standards across 5 U.S. states. It's a project called CSAIL, C-S-A-I-L, you can Google it. And Texas is one of our 5 states in that study as well. And so we're doing longitudinal surveys of teachers to understand what standards implementation is looking like. And we're also designing interventions to help teachers improve the alignment of their instruction with Texas's standards. So those are some studies that I'm doing. And so a lot of my work is in this area of college and career-ready standards. And I'll just give briefly in 1 minute sort of what I see as where we are right now in terms of education policy, particularly around standards. So I think folks have already identified, some of the last panelists have identified, that we have serious issues in terms of achievement and attainment in this country. And in particular, we have low overall levels of achievement and attainment, and we have incredible achievement and opportunity gaps separating both racial ethnic groups, but actually, even more importantly, I think at this point, socioeconomic groups. Whereas racial ethnic gaps have been closing somewhat over time, socioeconomic gaps have been getting much, much wider. And I don't think that has everything to do with schools. I think it has something to do with schools, but it has a lot to do with just the general economic trends that are happening in our society. That said, overall outcomes have been sort of trending up for a while. Texas, when you control for who the students are in the state, Texas has been one of the higher achieving states in the country. But I think that the outcomes have not been trending up fast enough, and then there's also some troubling signs of a dip in performance on the most recent wave of the national assessments. I think that standards and accountability clearly are sort of a fundamental input that can improve outcomes for kids. I think there's a great deal of research that shows that accountability can improve outcomes for kids. But standards and accountability alone are not going to solve our educational problems. They are one element, and there needs to be a much more systematic effort to improve outcomes. And that's going to include not just schools, it's going to include other kinds of social policies as well. So I guess I'll just stop there.
Great. I mean, I think that to me leads in. We were kind of talking a little bit in the back, teeing off of a couple of questions that were asked at the last panel. That conversation on, do you have accountability or do you have a love of teaching and learning? And can you actually have both of those? I'll give you the heads up. We actually all agree you can have both. So you're going to hear pretty much similar things from that. But I also, I mean, it's interesting you talk about, Morgan, not just the standards and accountability that are in the schools, but also it's that community, it's that parent. I mean, that was something I was hearing Colleen saying of, we do have a disconnect of, you can have all the great standards and assessments can be wonderful and can be tied, and if you aren't explaining and helping people understand what that is, then I think you're still losing, because you'll still have opt-out movements and all of these things that crop up. So I would love to hear, I mean, I'll kind of throw it open, but a little bit of that conversation of the can you have teaching and learning and accountability, and maybe we start with our school district folks and just hear a little bit about that.
Sure. So not only can you have it, I think it's essential. When I look at the fact that, and this is national, you look at the gaps that exist not only in K-12 with children of color, when you look at children that live in poverty, and you look at it, whether you look at it K-12, you look at it in higher ed. Frankly, one of the things that saddens me is that I'm a first-generation student. I was the first in my family that graduated from high school, went to college. My parents, I was born in Mexico, came to this country when I was 5, grew up in Chicago. And, when I look at the fact that, almost 30 years ago, my high school experience and my wife had a similar experience, and when we look at what's happening now in many high schools, it hasn't changed very much. The gaps are still there. And so I say that, and one of the things that we're pushing in our district is we just have to look at the work in a different way. So definitely accountability has to be grounded in terms of high expectations, making sure that we all talk about the fact that we want our children to have the best opportunities possible. So whatever a middle-class family has, we have to replicate those same type of supports and systems around counseling, making sure they're in advanced placement classes or international baccalaureate classes. We're expanding aggressively into dual credit classes. One of the things that we're working right now with the community colleges, so my children in the community, there's such a low set of expectations around college going. One of the things that we find is that, and we mirror the state. So about half of our graduates go to college, 3/4 go to the community college. We mirror the state, exactly. And our county mirrors the state. And what's interesting is that, what we find with our children is that they'll actually go through they'll fill out their financial aid forms. They will actually even register for college, and especially at the community college, and then they don't show up. So what we're doing right now with the community college presidents is we're saying, let's, next year we're going to pilot where we're going to take juniors and seniors and actually take classes Not just my high kids that already are early college programs, but these are my kids that are in the middle, and we're going to have them take classes at on the college campus. Because I said, if they're not here, they just don't think it's for them. They can't make that transition. And so we're gonna pilot that with about 500 children next year, and the goal is to expand it to over a couple thousand over the next few years, because frankly, the community college outcomes are very low. And when I look at the impact that it has, especially like I said, when I look at their overall averages statewide in our county, they're low. And I know when I look at my own children in terms of our children that live in poverty, children of color, they're even lower. And so, and the conversation we're having at the high schools is, these are the outcomes that we're seeing. And therefore, we're gonna need to change the way we're approaching our work. So we're putting pre-AP programs, and I know Houston is very big on this, pre-AP programs in the middle schools. We're aligning our literacy initiatives around pre-K to 3, which right now have some misalignment. So, and frankly, we're embracing accountability, because we know that even the accountability system is changing. The goal is to help our children be stronger and be better prepared.
So in HISD, we've had a lot of noise around opt-out movement. I think it's actually a pretty small group who's actually opting their kids out of tests, but a lot of the conversation was spurred on by our teacher evaluation system and our merit pay system, which is no longer going to exist. Unfortunately, it was is going to be cut out of our budget in June, I believe. But what we see in reality on campuses are families and parents who are really actively trying to get their children into our schools that do well on these accountability measures. And those schools also have the points of light and the joyful aspects to them that I think you acknowledge and that we believe can coexist in a school. And one of the things that I believe and that I've watched as we transition from the tax accountability system to the STAR accountability system is that under tax, our schools figured out how to kind of dance in that system and get kids to perform with a lot of drill and kill tutoring specifically around the test. And as we transition to STAR, which is centered around higher standards, more complex questions, that we know kids who are highly literate, have high numeracy skills really don't struggle. The test doesn't feel or appear that different to them from the STAR than it does to kids who are basically taught to that testing standard. We've seen this incredible backlash, both among, I think, the school leaders and teachers, that they can no longer show up as a highly rated campus in our accountability system, and then around the more vocal, autonomous parent whose child might not be scoring as well on that test because it turns out real teaching and learning wasn't happening in their campus. And in HISD, we have a lot of simultaneous programs that I think are impacting kids' outcomes on STAR that are also resulting in authentic teaching and learning. We have a Literacy by 3 program that has shown great increases in our 3rd grade reading scores, which is the first point where a pre-K through 3rd grade initiative is going to show up. And it'll be interesting to see if those scores persist as the same kids roll up in our system. We also have lots of high-performing elementary schools, and then we see a huge cliff drop off at middle school. And I think that is a great place for us to study and try to figure out, are we getting false results and pictures of who our kids are and what they know at the elementary level, or are we not actually teaching and learning at a deep level in the middle school? HISD has also put in a lot of programs specifically for our high school kids. Every single kid sits for the PSAT, the SAT, starting in 8th grade. Our 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th graders all take the PSAT on a school day. All the juniors take the SAT on a school day. We immediately saw an uptick in kids that were testing at college-ready rates. We've put in the Emerge program that has had a great increase in application acceptance to Tier 1 universities. I think the first year there were a handful of kids, and 3 years out we now have 184 kids. Those kids have a 97% persistence rate in college, which I think is pretty incredible because they're all low-income, underserved kids. And I think the decision to not wait until we get it exactly right at the bottom and put in these initiatives like our AP initiative in high school. When I started on the board, we had many high schools that didn't have one single AP offering. And now all of our high schools have at least 10 to 15. Not every single one of those kids scores a 3 or higher on the exam, but they're getting access to higher level instruction. And the people in the elementary and middle schools are starting to view their kids as kids that are on that same path, and that does make an impact. I worry, though, greatly not having an external standard for Algebra 2 and English 3. We have a gap kind of in the sophomore year of high school because all our kids who take AP also have to take the AP test, and we pay for it. And so there's this gap at the sophomores and I guess some juniors taking Algebra 2, there is no external measurement, none. I have a daughter who's in one of our highest performing high schools taking Algebra 2 and chemistry this year, and she comes home and says she hasn't learned anything. And it'll be interesting to see how that impacts her higher level math and science performance. Because the teacher doesn't really have any incentive. She has kids that are bright, you know, that are learning, but there isn't any incentive to ensure the kids are getting a full Algebra 2 course. And if that's happening in one of our highest performing high schools with high performing kids that are quick studies, quick learners, it's got to be having a great impact in our low-income high schools with our kids. I know I just ticked off like a million different like problems and
there's a lot
pluses,
of things I want to.
but if you want to,
Well, and
dig
really,
on,
I mean, it's interesting. Kind of the last thing you said is it's a little bit of that you know, it doesn't count, and so therefore does that drop your your performance or your level of you know, of paying attention, I guess. Going back to the middle school piece a little bit, because I'm interested to know with the pathways and HB5 that we put in place. I mean, do you think people will obviously have to change what they're doing in middle schools if there is that drop off from elementary schools? Because I do believe, I mean, just going back to our work at the Bush Institute, I mean, looking at having to actually put in place different practices and policies in the middle schools that are tied to research that actually works. I mean, you can tell why middle schools are kind of that place where you try not to, you know, poke the bear too much until they get to high school. And you can understand why kids fall off the cliff there. So
I'm just going to personally say I'm not a fan of HB5. I think the pathway exercise in HISD is a box-checking exercise. There's a form. I have someone entering 9th grade in my family, and we got this little form. He is going to the Performing Arts High School, so it's a no-brainer which pathway he's on. I know when I have access to middle school parents, I encourage them strongly to focus less on the pathway and make sure their kids are taking the most rigorous and difficult courses that they have access to, and to be that support for their kid, to make sure that they're getting what they need. If there's a concern around grades, our parents all have these. They really do. We hear all the time that low-income parents don't have access to technology. It's not true. They have smartphones. Their kids have them. They can see and understand what's going on in the classroom. They want to know, and I worry that our schools are not advising them at the same rate to take these higher level courses. Now we have the release valve of HB 149 where kids can pass as few as 3 of the 5 exams and still graduate from our schools. And so, you know, the pathways I think are interesting, they're clever, they're creative, but they're not going to be the things that make sure our kids are prepared for college and career in a real way that Mr. Hunt and Senator Shapiro mentioned in the last panel.
So one of the things we're doing with our levels, and then it goes back to this concept of just approaching the work differently and understanding who our children are and what their challenges are. So we have, similar to many of the urban districts in Texas, the majority of our middle schools underperform. And they underperform compared to our elementary schools, they underperform in general. So what we're doing now is with 3 of our middle schools, for example, this year we did a restart where we're converting them into pre-K academies. One will be a dual language, one will be a STEM academy. One of them actually is an all-boys school. They just started this year, 4 through 6, building up to 8th grade. We're going to expand downwards and upwards. We just got their 5th grade scores not too long ago. They just knocked it out of the ballpark. Same children, high poverty boys, but the teachers were specifically trained on strategies, a lot of technology, and it's fascinating. You know, we gave them furniture that's movable because boys tend to move a lot. So we're just doing the work very differently. We're opening up a pre-K to 12 academy this next fall that will start in K-10, and it's going to be a lab school. It's in partnership with Trinity University, the top university in our community, and what's going to make the school different is we're not going to have bells. We're not going to have bell times. We will allow children within limits to interact with, across different grade levels. So if we have a 5th grader who's ready for 7th grade math, we're going to let them be with 7th graders who are taking math. And conversely, if they're struggling in reading and they need to be with 4th graders, we will do that. Everything will be project-based. And frankly, it's fascinating. It's not it's a district charter which has, any child can apply from anywhere in the district, but we don't have any kind of testing criteria to get in. And we're integrating. The whole curriculum will be integrated. And so for us, what we're finding is that the old structures, the ways we've been doing things, at least for our district, I'll just speak for that, because over 93% of my children live in poverty. I have a very small population of middle-class parents. Is that, it hasn't really worked. And frankly, these strategies are also bringing back some middle-class families. So we actually have 40% of the children that want to go to this new school, this new academy, are actually from outside the district. So we're actually seeing, for the first time in San Antonio, in our district, an interest, and we're looking at other models that we're going to be creating over time.
That's great.
There's a couple points I wanted to make. One point that was just hinted at and was brought up last night in the talk by Secretary Page, which I think underlies all of these discussions and really is fundamental to any effort to improve education, is the role of governance. And there are, I'm frankly a skeptic about the ability to systemically improve our education system with the governance structures that we have in place. And I think when we're thinking about, things like, when we say, for instance, oh, the model looks the same as it was 100 years ago, well, that's true of our governance structures as well, and that's another thing that we need to be thinking about. I mean, 15,000 school districts and 15,000 school boards, I'm not optimistic that that's the way to improve outcomes for kids. Another point that I wanted to make, going back to the question that you asked a while ago, is about this sort of tension between accountability and good instruction, which is this dichotomy that's often set out there. And I think it's just very obviously a false dichotomy. Any time you go into a really high-performing school, whether it's a charter school, I was just visiting Success Academy in New York earlier this year, or whether it's the high-performing school that I went to, which was a public high school in the Chicago suburbs, there is a lot of accountability for everyone, for the kids and for the teachers, and there's really great instruction. I think that a lot of this perceived, tension is really about people who don't really want accountability. There are entrenched interests that are pushing against the idea that folks should be accountable for high performance. And then the last point that I want to make, these are 3 totally disparate points, but I guess they're all kind of connected by this idea of structures and governance, is about curriculum, which I think is very closely related to the idea of structures and governance. So, another way in which we are unique as a country is, with respect to 15,000 districts, 15,000 different curricula, and even within school districts, oftentimes different schools will use different curricula, different teachers within schools will use different curricula. There's just no, again, I keep using this word, there's just no systematic approach to curriculum in this country like there is in many other countries. So whenever I'm at an airport and I'm sitting next to someone from another country and they ask what I do and I start talking about it and I tell them that I research textbooks, they don't understand that because in basically every other country there's one textbook.
Right.
And that's not the structure that we are exactly the opposite of that. And I'm not saying that you have to have one textbook, but I am saying that it's hard for me, again, to see the idea of real systemic improvement in education when everyone's creating their own curriculum. I don't think that that's a recipe for improvement.
Well, I guess, and I look at it and think, how are you comparable? Because I suppose I go back to, is it inputs or outcomes? As long as the outcomes are great, that's fine. Like you do what is really working, and I'll do the check at the end, and we're all good.
I'm fine with that. I think
if
that
we get rid of the check, that's
right.
where the problem
No,
comes
we
in.
need to have the check. I think the concern is that there's this perception or belief in this country that it somehow takes the joy out of teaching to give teachers a good textbook, right? Like you can't, that it is a fundamental part of the teaching role for people to create their own curriculum. And I don't think it makes sense for 3 million teachers to each create their own curriculum. That just is not a way to improve.
Definitely.
Could I say something about the governance? Because I'm the elephant in the
Yes.
room. You know, I agree that the governance model we have now is not going to transform anything. We, on our board, spend more time talking about who is going to provide a service that we pay a lot of money to get. The majority of our time is spent on contract decisions, on bond projects, on the minutia of that, because they all revolve around who's going to make money off of our system. There's nothing that bothers me more than when I read on a social media platform about the evil, let me see if I can get it right, corporate industrial education complex, which is, you know, supposedly all these people out there making buckets of money off of charter schools. And there are people that make buckets of money off of charter schools that don't educate kids, but there's a whole lot more people making buckets of money off of our traditional ISDs. And we see what's happening right now in New Orleans. There's an incredibly different education landscape there because they changed the governance structure and they're about to hand it all back to an elected school board. And the only reason I think that's happening is because there is a pipeline of dollars that goes into the community. And I don't foresee, in Houston, we have 287 schools, I think, in our district. I don't see traditional ISDs totally dissolving and going away. But I think we have to transition into a different kind of governance model that includes more and different vehicles that kids get educated through, charter schools, that we have data information systems. I think Dallas, probably in Texas, is doing the best job of an external entity really pushing for transparent information to get out to parents and communities. And people who are in my role need to really look in the mirror and ask who they're serving. You know, it is so hard for us to focus on the accountability systems. I mean, since I've been on the school board, we've shifted from tax to STAR, and every single year, everybody's waiting on pins and needles to find out what the cut scores are gonna be, or is the test gonna count or not? And I really question who is actually sitting in a classroom with the responsibility of putting information into a child's brain and making sure that they leave with the ability to bring it back out when we're so focused on trying to game that system to make sure we look a certain way, and really we're spending the majority of our energy on all these other things that do not impact outcomes for children. And And I think it really warrants a serious conversation. It warrants people, running for these positions. They are not sexy, they're not exciting. We don't do it to, I don't do it to get some kind of accolades. It's hard work, and it's screaming for serious people that have no other intention or desire from the work other than making sure the 2,000 kids whose hands I'm going to shake next week and are going to walk away from a diploma actually have something within themselves to enable them to be the agents of their own futures.
Well, and the reality is that, speaking from a superintendent's perspective, there's nothing more critical in terms of having stable, and leadership with a long-term perspective than having a stable board with a stable superintendent. And if you look at the number one, reason why superintendents leave is usually because of a change in a board, or something that happens in governance. And the reality is we do minimize the impact of, and it is, board members here are not paid. It's a very, you can win, you can win because, for every tough decision you make, you upset a group of people. And so, I think it's really important that we do recognize the importance of governance structures and boards. And the reality is that, in Chicago, we created one of the first in-district, we actually created charters in our district where we were the authorizers. So we brought them in, we brought in the KIPs of the world. And it was interesting, what I learned in that process is there's no magic bullet. The trick is, you gotta have amazing teachers, strong principals, again, stable leadership. Call it a charter school, call it a traditional school, call it a magnet school, I don't care what you call it. It's all the same elements, but having that stability, the right governance, and frankly, and Chicago was an appointed school board, and at that time it worked because we had a mayor that, was very supportive. When we left in 2009, there was a lot of changes, and frankly, if you look at Chicago now, they're not doing so well. And so there's no magical governance system. It really is, but as you said, there's nothing more important to me than a board trustee role that most of the time in elections, people overlook those. And they're probably the most important positions we have in our communities.
That is very true. I could talk about leadership all day. I very much felt that conversation last night was very important as well. I do want to get us to some audience questions, but I want to first talk a little bit about ESSA. As we were kind of having that conversation just via email about what we are doing now here in Texas with looking at our accountability system, making changes, putting in A through F, kind of marching along through the school years. How does that correlate with now what the new law directs or frankly doesn't direct to a certain extent? But I would love to get a little bit of Morgan's perspective, just because you've been working with another state, and kind of talk to us a little bit about how do you not water down and yet have a broad sort of not just one test, one day, one snapshot type of thing?
So I've recently served on a California state task force on accountability, where we basically proposed to the State Board of Education an accountability system. We met a bunch of times, and it was, it's California, so it was basically me and Linda Darling-Hammond, who is a professor at Stanford, and then 40 members of the California Teachers Association. And
poor
I know. And so, so basically the gist of that conversation was consequential accountability was off the table from the very beginning. That the state wanted to do the absolute minimum that was required by ESSA law and not one thing more than that. And I get a sense that there's a very strong backlash right now in Texas to accountability as well. And so, what I wanted to get into that proposal, because I knew that we weren't going to get real serious accountability, was, the number one complaint about No Child Left Behind was how excessively focused it was on tests and just in 2 subjects, and it led to the narrowing of the curriculum and that sort of thing. And that's what people really complained about. So what I really wanted to get was, if that's your complaint, and now the feds are giving you opportunities to do more, then do more. Don't just do the same and then complain 5 years out that you're seeing the same things, right? So even if we don't feel like we have the best measures in the world for these other things that we think that we might care about, like non-cognitive skills and social emotional outcomes and different measures of college and career readiness, like, let's try it. I mean, what's the worst that's going to happen, right? So I advocated for a really diverse set of measures where it was, 51% test scores, which is the, what they require, and the rest, all different kinds of outcomes that I think people really understand that we want more out of our schools than just test scores. We want a lot of these other things. And so why not, now that we have the opportunity, build a system that allows you to measure some of those, even if it might be seen as watering down a little bit. I still think that refocusing the system on the things that we really care about is a good way to go.
I would agree with that. I sat in a professional development earlier this year, and the social studies curriculum director was there, and she had this fabulous information about the U.S. Constitution and the founding fathers, and they were saying, well, teachers won't teach this because it's not tested. And I was like, well, that's ridiculous. If a fourth grader can read this and have a conversation around it, they're just going to do better on the reading test because they're more highly literate. They have actually context behind the words that they've learned. And so why would anyone say, I'm not going to teach this, which is part of what fourth graders are supposed to learn, because it's not tested? And that is one of the most frustrating things I hear that happens in our schools with our kids that need to have those conversations in the classroom more than anyone else. We also know that if kids have access to arts instruction, they're more highly literate and they perform better on these measurements. And so it's frustrating in my role because I can't go in and direct people in a school what to do, but to see time and again that our schools are retreating from these kind of activities and lessons, which result in better outcomes on the measurements. And so I agree with Morgan that, like, why not? Let's jump off the cliff and actually teach kids in ways we know make them more literate adults that are going to be able to function and do well in higher education.
Well, and I guess that's I think an excellent question, because, I hated that No Child Left Behind didn't allow people to teach anything but reading and math. Oh, I'm sorry. That actually wasn't the federal law.
Right.
But now that they're free to
Right.
teach anything they would like, that's great. But I guess and where I come back, clearly I have some baggage from many, many years of this. But I mean, what I come back to is, I guess, if you've got sort of the chicken and egg of, if it's not tested, then we don't focus on it, but please don't put too many tests in place. And so, and it's kind of the round and round. How do you get to is that a leadership question of a principal or a superintendent saying?
Well, it's, and I think, we talked about this earlier, like when parents ask me, so how, superintendent, how do I make sure that my children are being prepared? And I said, well, again, let's talk about your aspirations for your children, right? And if it's a middle-class family, immediately you hear college. And of course, in my high-poverty families, I'm saying college, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be Harvard, but it should be at least a community college at a minimum. And one of the things that's frustrating for our staff is the fact that you'll see children that could be proficient on a state exam, but yet it's a false indicator on whether they'll do well on an SAT or whether they'll do well on an AP exam. And so, absolutely, I mean, what happens in our schools is they focus so much on our state assessment. So I think we have a great opportunity to try to align these systems. And one of the things, for example, that I really believe in is that, one of the responsibilities of our state is, let's not try to trick our kids or teachers. I mean, let's be really clear. Let's have good interim assessments that can really give good leading information so that teachers can adjust their instruction based on that data. And then let's make the state assessment, a minimum sort of, like make sure you meet those minimums, but then let's make sure we also encourage how we challenge children, so that we encourage children to be in pre-AP classes or international baccalaureate classes. So I do think that this is a great opportunity. Frankly, there's no more excuses. You can't blame the feds anymore.
Right.
But it really is, we have to work together. And And it's complicated because we have rural school districts and urban school districts and suburban school districts. So we have to figure out how to meet those needs. But one of the concerns that I have is we have a goal of 60% of our adults having some kind of college, post-secondary certificate or above. We're less than half of that. We're the state that's growing and poverty's growing. And so for me, if we don't align these systems correctly, my fear is that we're not going to reach that goal. And what I tell our families and our community is that you need to reach that goal. Because my child who's a middle class, comes from a middle class family, he might be okay if he doesn't go to college. We'll kill him, and my wife and I will be miserable, and we'll be really upset at him, but he'll probably be okay. Most of our children that live in poverty are not going to be okay. And I have this argument sometimes with some of our city officials and county officials and some of my colleagues that, you can't say, well, not every child has to go to college, they can just go find a job. I'm sorry, my children are going to end up in a retail store and a fast food place making minimum wage. That's what's going to happen to them. I know it already. That's why we have the poorest zip codes in our county, because that's what's happened in the last 3 decades. And so the reality is we got to align these systems, really foster what's important, which is having children getting inspired, having them have some hope, getting exposure to some of these areas of technology and healthcare, teaching. I mean, there's some great professions, and I think we just got to open their eyes. And so, again, this is our chance to build that kind of system.
So can I say something about, my understanding, and there's a lot of people that did this work on creating the system and the standards that STAR is based on, was that is a system that when we have the fully phased in proficiency rates, because what we have right now does not tell us that kids are, just like you said,
It's true.
if kids are performing and moving up, it is aligned to what our college standards are. That's the whole reason why it was built. Of course, always room for improvement, always room for pivoting, always room for redirecting. But when we found out, oh no, and I could use an expletive there, our kids can't even get the proficiency rates that we made up so we wouldn't look as bad as we really are.
That's true.
Everybody just went running for the door and said, we're throwing this one out because it's age inappropriate, or it's wrong, or it's not actually testing something that matters. And I just reject that. I think it's ridiculous. I think it's unfair for our kids that need us to have a system in place that we stick with and we stand by, and
that we're willing to change the practice to
Right.
match where we are, as opposed to saying the measuring stick is
And we're guilty
is
of it
wrong.
in HISD. We really are. When I've been on the board, there's been a lot of talk about, decentralization has become a bad word. There's been a lot of directives from on high about how to do this. I can't tell you the number of times when I first got on the board, sitting around the table with 10 people coming up with a great idea, and then running into someone in the grocery store that actually worked in a classroom who said, did you think about this, and this? And I was like, oh my God, no, I didn't. And I ran back to the 10 people, and they were like, they didn't know what they were talking about. But really, it's, now I got lost, and the point I was making, but our kids need us to stick with this stuff and to kind of put the pressure on the people working in the classroom and give them the authority to do their job, provide them with supports and resources, but make it about the outcomes that the kids have. And I don't think we have a bunch of mean, grumpy people in our classrooms who really don't want that to happen for our kids. I think they're exhausted, they're tired, they've been told what to do, and then they're punished because somebody else's idea didn't actually have a great outcome for the kids. And that's not something I'm real proud of, because I've supported the policies that have resulted in that kind of behavior. But I don't think it's a requirement for that behavior to happen. And I think that's, the question that Morgan posed and all of us do. We can't use the policy as an excuse for bad behavior.
Or even the sort of policy to what does it look like in actual implementation? Because I think that's where I've seen, it's the law is perfect until it starts being implemented. So I do want to leave time for questions, and we already have one here. So Donna, go ahead. I think the mic's coming around, but you can go ahead and start if you'd like to.
I have a very loud voice. Yes, I wanted to know, Morgan, what you were saying you were on this panel in California, and you started to say this, but maybe I just wasn't catching it. The 51%, could you kind of talk about the accountability? Because we are in this midst of this big conversation right now, and so it's very relevant to what we need to get your perspective on.
And I can share with you the report, which is public, because it was presented to the State Board of Education a couple weeks ago. So essentially, we started this conversation with all the CTA folks in the room complaining about how much testing there was. And then when they start with the first draft of this report was 100% testing. And that accountability will be based strictly on test scores, because those were the only data that we had. And admittedly, California has horrendous educational data, especially compared to Texas. It's deplorable. But I and a few other people in the room said, well, if you're going to complain about test scores, being the driver, then let's try some other things. We all agree that that we care about the whole child, that is not just test scores. So it's things like social emotional learning. So we talked about possibly using statewide survey data. We talked about different kinds of college and career readiness outcomes. I said, boy, wouldn't it be nice if we actually had a data system, instead of just looking at readiness, that actually allowed you to track people beyond K-12 and saw what their outcomes were. Of course, we're very far from that in California, but in some other places that might be possible, and I think that would be really great. The gist of my argument was, if you think that these are important outcomes, these other things that are not test scores, and you think that they're not getting the kind of attention that they need in the current system, then be bold and come up with something that will allow you to do it, even if it's not perfect the first time around. So.
But you were saying the 51%, what was that?
Yeah, so it was ESSA requires that school accountability ratings be determined at least, I believe, at least 51% based on test scores, and so that's what is proposed. I don't know the exact number, but basically that's what's proposed. It's sort of the minimum that is required by ESSA law, and then the rest is on other kinds of non-test outcomes, like graduation rates and promotion rates and chronic absenteeism and these social emotional skills. I'm open to school climate. I think, why not? Like, again, we've got the opportunity. We'll learn and we'll see what works. I think there's, briefly, there's also the core districts, which you might have heard of or you might not have, but there's a set of 8 districts in California that got their own waiver from No Child Left Behind, because California wouldn't do the waiver because of the teacher accountability thing. So these 8 districts created their own system, and it's separate from the state system, and actually it's among the more innovative systems in the country, and it includes a lot of these kind of measures, and they came out with their first ratings this year, their first report cards. So I think they're also a really nice model, and a different way of thinking about governance too, in a state where.
Different ones, 8 different ones?
So it's these 8 districts. It's LA Unified, San Francisco, Oakland, a few other big urban districts, and they came together, and they all have the same system. They all have the same system, but it's different from the state system, because the state system is basically nothing.
And I think what's interesting about that is, and this to me is a lot of what ESSA is it also devolves accountability down to community levels. So it's looking at a great diverse system like that, but also going, okay, now where are cut scores, and how are these things sort of weighted in the system so that you still are actually able to have something rich and it's not watered down. So it's really, I mean, to me, it's looking at the community members as sort of keeping track of what's happening there. So we'll go over here. Yes, either one of you. Either one.
So it seems that one benefit of No Child Left Behind is that we actually created some national assessments of high quality. So I'm curious, in y'all's opinion, should states be recreating assessments and spending precious resources on those type of activities? Or should we just, like the Fordham Institute, just studied assessments and found that we have quite a few high quality ones to choose from that are actually aligned to college and career readiness?
So do you know that I was an author on that report? Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, listen. I mean, Texas is different from others. Texas isn't going to adopt Park or Smarter Balanced. So, I mean, I think that, so it's not clear to me that No Child Left Behind era tests were that good. I think we've got new tests, Park and Smarter Balanced are among them, but they're not the only ones that do seem to do a better job of measuring more complex skills. And, I mean, listen, I'm a centralizer, so I would love it if every state used the same test. I'll just put that out there. I know that that's not going to happen, but I think that there will be some real advantages to it. But that said, I think that you can still learn from these high-quality assessments that have been created and create something that works for Texas. I haven't reviewed the STAR test, so I don't really know that much about their quality. But there certainly are models out there.
And for me, I wouldn't have a problem with using the same test. I don't think we're that, making sure our kids are learning algebra and chemistry and things like that is not going to be that unique in Texas. I hope it's not as compared to other states. I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, we had the huge attack on Pearson, and we've ended up with the ETS, shall I call it a nightmare, of trying to find out how our kids did on the assessments this year for districts. And so, that part of it was working. Like we had accelerated the timeline on which districts got information back in the first couple of years. Schools were able to administer tests on computers, and now we have the situation where people are getting back, data for different kids that are in their schools or incomplete data. And I'll tell you that HISD hasn't even sent trustees reporting on how our kids did yet on the first, and I think we've done second administrations by now, if not third, to make sure our kids are passing, and that is not a good thing.
Yeah.
So I'd support one test. I'm not necessarily a centralizer around implementation, but around things like that.
And I think for our teachers, so again, we all agree that, accountability and summative assessments are necessary. What I worry about is if you don't have a clear, coherent system, so in other words, clear interim assessments, support and training for teachers around the use of formative assessments. In Chicago, it was interesting, the state, when we were there, changed so that they had consistent interim and summative assessments, and we were able, and this is a district with 400,000 kids, we were able to just create better alignment over a 3-year period, and we got a 30-point jump in proficiency just from the strengthening of the alignment. And what I learned in that experience is that, again, teachers are not against tests. What they don't like is when things are not aligned, when the professional development and the materials and the interim assessments are not, because the data is very valuable. I mean, they can see where children are at and where children need help. But if it's not all aligned, it's just very frustrating, because then they're working very hard, and then they take a summative assessment, and then they get a different result than they thought they were going to get. And that's just very discouraging.
Definitely.
I do also want to just say that I think that there is an element of political will as well, particularly around, a lot of states, this has happened in a lot of states where they adopted a new test, and then there was a big blow up, and then they went to another new test, and then that one blew up, and now they're on their third test. And those things have consequences. I mean, when you make, they're sort of unforced errors, but also, when you basically say we screwed up and we're going to try something new, and then we did it again, and people stop paying attention. Mm-hmm. And I think that you need to, regardless of what your situation is, do the best job you can to find the best test you can or the best policy you can, and then let it sit for a few years. Mm-hmm. Because otherwise, if the goal is constantly changing, I think that really undermines things.
Well, and I think it does. I think it lessens the trust that people have in the system or in the measurement, especially if they don't understand all that's gone into creating it. Mm-hmm. I will speak for the, maybe I'll call it the reality of being in Texas. We're going to Texify everything, and we're going to have our own standards. And so, but I think we can still work within that to have a data system that is rich, that is aligned, that is, I mean, to your point, that teachers can understand, and frankly, parents can understand. I don't think that's a utopia that can't exist. I just think it takes political will, it takes patience. I mean, I think that is very important. I mean, I was laughing going back and looking at, I just happened to look at something that was someone in, I think it was like early 2003, talking about how horrible No Child Left Behind was and all of this, and I kept thinking, it wasn't even implemented. My God, like, you know, there was nothing, you know, actually being done to you. And I thought the same thing for, you know, for all the conversations that we had here, that we're very quick to pass something and then immediately go into how horrible it is before it's been implemented into the system. And I think that takes all of us communicating. This actually does take time in the system. So let me look at our time here. Maybe we have time for one more question.
I got over here.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, sorry. Sorry, sir.
That's okay. Oh, sorry about
She's
that.
got the mic.
Mr. Martinez, I was interested in, you talked about I think it was the all-boys school, and how you did specific training with the teachers, and then you had a giant jump. And what I'm interested in is, do you think it was the teachers you got? Was it because they got very specific training and support? Were they able to be more innovative because this is a new school? What made the difference there? Because this feels like this could be tying into a lot of the things that we've been talking about.
Yeah, so I think it was a combination of all the elements. So first of all, you know, it was a different type of school, so it also, and teachers that went into that school knew that it was a different type of school, so they went very open-minded, and so they received a lot of training, a lot of strategy, project-based learning. I mean, and what they appreciated was that everything was very research-based. In other words, we really did our homework around what really works with boys, especially at that age of 4th to 6th grade, which, you know, is kind of, if anybody has parents of that age of children, you know, 10 and 12 years old. And so, and then frankly, that we actually, you know, gave them the technology, that we actually gave them the materials. Like I said, even, you know, I didn't make that big of a deal of it, but the furniture, you know, because I never really pay attention that much to furniture. But the fact that these chairs were movable and the kids could, you know, I mean, and I realized, especially with and these are, again, this is in one of the poorest zip codes in our district, same, you know, again, high poverty boys, and like I said, you know, we saw the first round of 5th grade scores, and I was just so excited for them because I knew how hard they worked. And I said, wow, I mean, this is something that we're really gonna watch. And so for us, you know, the challenge will be now, the next question we're asking is, the school's expanding, so how do we make sure we maintain that? And then how do we scale that up, right? How do we replicate that? But we're definitely, you know, observing it, getting a lot of good lessons from it. But again, for us, it just reinforced the fact that we just can't approach the work the same way. Not when children have these type of challenges. We gotta just be more innovative. We gotta train teachers and be supportive of that.
Great. I think, I don't know if we need to get off, or if we've got time for one more question. If we've got one more, certainly, sir. Former Commissioner.
I don't need that. I have a comment and then a question. The comment, Anna.
We'll take your question only, thank you. You're not allowed to comment about me.
Anna, you mentioned about the back and forth that goes on in the sort of the setting and the standards and moving back. You're going to have an opportunity to visit with the Deputy Commissioner, and I would strongly urge you that during the course of that conversation, the conversation you had with the Commissioner and throughout his tenure, that you guys protect his back. Because part of the reason that happens is because when consequences occur, folks get shaky and folks want him to provide some relief.
Right.
Morgan, based upon your research, what would you tell these folks are let's say the 2 biggest drivers for student success in an accountability system?
Well, I mean, I think that everyone's already said that teachers are clearly the most important within-school factor that affects student outcomes. So teacher quality is a clear driver. I personally have a belief that that instruction, which is of course related to teachers, but that instruction and curriculum in particular is also a huge driver of student outcomes. We actually, you know, I mean, again, if you look at our curricula in this country compared to the curricula of other countries, it's not just that we have hundreds of different textbooks and they have one, but it's also that they look very different. I mean, a math textbook in this country looks like this, right? And a math textbook in Singapore or China looks like this. And it's just much more coherent and organized and logically structured from grade to grade. And some of that has to do with the fact that I think that there's higher capacity among the teachers there to really do good math instruction, for instance, than there is here. But you know, a lot of it just has to do with the fact that you know, it was explicitly created with that kind of coherence in mind.
I should have said at the top of this, as a fellow Trojan, welcome to Texas.
Thank you.
We allowed those folks to win that game.
All right, well, thank you very much, panel. This has been wonderful, and thank you all for your questions.